Morning, everyone. Lovely to be in Dorking again on this beautiful day. I'm going to talk about planning. I'm going to talk about spatial planning. I'm going to talk about strategic planning in the context of actually quite a changing landscape in terms of how we are working in places like Surrey around planning. So I think it's hopefully going to be a useful context for the rest of the day. It's not full of issues around the environment, but I think it's very important context within which you will be planning for the environment over the next 10, 20, 30 years, or the rest of the century, as we just heard. So just in terms of context, in terms of what the government is planning, and you will be very familiar with all of this, the government has set out a number of missions, very much around growth, around sustainable growth, and the target of achieving 1.5 million new homes within the first Parliament, so basically by 2029, is one of the main targets around the economic growth mission. There's lots of questions about whether that's achievable or not, but I think anybody that is following I think every week we seem to get another bit of planning reform, and we have had since last July. You'll recognise that the government is very serious about doing this, very serious at least about getting the number of homes up. And that's not within a context of it all just being about housing, and I think that's really important, and I think that's the bit that I will try and focus on now. This is very much, housing is very much part of that, but it is absolutely not by any means the only part of that. Strategic planning is something we had for decades. And I'm sure there are plenty in the room that remember the Surrey Structure Plan, the South East Plan. Strategic planning has existed as part of the formal system since the 60s. It was abolished in 2010 or 2011 through the Localism Act, and we've been sort of trying to find our way back ever since then, because it played a very important role. And one of the really important roles that strategic plans have always played is around that ringmaster role around growth. Excuse me. And making sure that it isn't just about housing, but making sure that policies around the economy, policies around the environment, climate, around social equity, make sure that we've got enough affordable housing, all these different things that go in to make good growth, not necessarily just growth at all costs, are taken into account. So strategic plans are very much the ringmasters of growth if we get it right. And I've put that definition there because it's also really important to recognise that they are not big local plans. They are spatial investment frameworks that are about trying to make sure that we invest, whether it's in the environment, whether it's in infrastructure, whether it's in housing, but that we invest in the right places and through the right means. So these are going to be really important parts of the new planning system. Again, for those that are more familiar with local plans, they will not be allocating sites, so they will have a map, a very important map. And again, Surrey Place ambition, for those that are familiar with it, that sort of key diagram that sits alongside that is going to be the sort of thing that we're probably going to get in terms of the new world of spatial planning. I've highlighted there local nature recovery strategies, and in the Surrey context, the local environment improvement plan, which Carolyn will be talking about later. These are going to be really important parts of the new spatial plans. These are going to feed into the new spatial plans, and the strategic plans, which are going to be spatial development strategies, will effectively be the spatial articulation of a lot of these different plans and strategies that are already currently in the system, but also new plans and strategies, local energy plans, local growth plans, all the forthcoming new plans that we're going to see. So these will all be, the spatial plan will provide that spatial articulation. That will be its main purpose. So in terms of where the government is going with all of this, it's very difficult actually to see the screen, so apologies. Spatial development strategies is the new model. It sounds very technical, and the London plan, for example, is a spatial development strategy. We probably won't call them spatial development strategies when they emerge, but they will be the new strategic planning regime, and they will be part of the statutory planning system, so they will sit alongside the local plan. As we call it, the single development plan will be made up of 3 different parts. So it will be the strategic plan, the spatial development strategy, the local plan, and neighbourhood plans where they exist. So that is the concept, that is where we're going. They will provide that high-level framework, so they will provide sort of levers and hooks for all the various plans and strategies, including the local plans, to actually take forward delivery. There'll be long-term plans, so we're looking at these providing a framework for at least 20 years, probably longer. So it's to help address issues around climate change, for example, and some of the things that we don't necessarily look at particularly well at this moment in time, because everything is done on a very short-term basis, and that includes, I would argue, some of the government agencies in terms of national highways and things like that. There's a very short-term approach to planning at the moment and to growth. So these are supposed to help bring that longer-term framework so that we can actually invest in the longer term over the next sort of few decades. The scope will be kept very tight, and again, this is really important. I think we've had a lot of mission creep lately, and getting the balance right between what sits within a spatial plan and what sits elsewhere is going to be important. One of the arguments around the planning system, as it is being too clunky, is that it's trying to do too much, not because we've asked it to do too much. It's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Biodiversity net gain is absolutely incredibly important, but again, arguably, everything over the last sort of 15 years or so has been put onto the planning system to do, and it's not necessarily fit for purpose to do that. So we need to be much more flexible about what tools we've got in the box to actually make this all work, but also make everything work together. So these will be high-level frameworks. The scope will be set by government, so they will do a job, a fairly tight job, so it will set the housing numbers for each of the local planning authorities, and that is quite a big change to what we have at the moment. So currently each local planning authority is giving a housing target by the government, standard methodology, and that is for the local planning authority to deliver. Of course, we have current mechanisms like the duty to cooperate to make sure that where a local authority can't meet its needs, it has an ability to have hopefully some constructive conversations with neighbouring authorities, but it hasn't really worked particularly well, and certainly in places like Surrey it's probably not worked well at all. So the number in future will be allocated to the strategic area, and it will be up to the strategic planning authority to decide how that is distributed to each local planning authority area. Again, that's really important because it means that there is more choice. You have a much bigger spatial canvas on which to make some decisions. So arguably, you are going to be directing growth to the best, most sustainable locations, avoiding some of the big constraints, and not the least worst area. And again, we've seen so many examples, I think, of development ending up in places just because it's the least offensive. It's the area politically that's the least offensive. It's the area that has got less constraint on it, but not necessarily because it's in the best location. They will also have to review the Greenbelt, and I know that is something for places like Surrey with about 74% Greenbelt is a big issue. There is absolutely no doubt that some Greenbelt will be released, but the hope is in future that if it's done through that strategic scale plan, it will be released in a much more directive way. The strategic plan will have to set what we call the general extent of the Greenbelt. So in places like Surrey, the Strategic Planning Authority will look at the Greenbelt as a whole and decide where growth is going to happen, and therefore where local plans will have to review the detailed boundaries. That also, the quid pro quo of that is it sort of releases the pressure on all local planning authorities to have to review their Greenbelt boundaries on a detailed basis. So absolutely there will be Greenbelt review, there's no doubt about that. The numbers in Surrey are pretty huge, but it will be in a much more directive way. The Greenbelt will be hopefully released in a much more directive way. In terms of the geography, the government's been quite clear that devolution is coming. The ambition is to have strategic authorities in place by the end of the first term, parliamentary term as well, right across England. Some of you will be familiar with the Devolution Priority Programme, where the government has identified some areas to fast track to mayoral strategic authorities. Surrey didn't quite get in that yet because it's got to go through the process of local government restructuring first, and that will come. That is getting fast tracked so that it can then move into the mayoral strategic authority governance structure. So in terms of who's responsible for these new plans, initially it will be the County Council, so not the local planning authorities. The County Council will make the decisions around the new strategic plan. The County Council will also therefore make the decisions around where the housing goes, the Green Belt Review, strategic infrastructure provision, etc. All going well and with a fair wind, then that power will eventually transfer to a mayoral strategic authority. And that, I think, is quite important in terms of timing-wise, because the view is that these will be prepared within a couple of years. If we keep the scope tight, if we use digital technology and all the tools available to us, that is absolutely perfectly doable. So the County Council, if you can imagine, would take this plan forward now, prepare it, and then submit it for examination. And then the first iteration of this plan would probably be adopted by the County Council, and any future reviews would be taken forward by the new and emerging mayoral strategic authority. Local planning authorities absolutely have a role in this, and we always talk about top-down, bottom-up approach. We can't decide where you put growth unless local planning authorities are directly involved, and they're the ones that will have to actually deliver these plans by allocating sites and dealing with some of the local infrastructure issues. So this has got to be a partnership between the County Council and the districts initially, and then through the mayoral strategic authority, which all local planning authorities, being the new unitaries, will be part of. The other thing I think to think about in terms of not the immediate, but again, it's part of the whole process. This is a system, so it's not just about the plan that's prepared. It's not just about the bit of paper that you'll see. There's going to be a lot of delivery tools that are going to be available to particularly the mayoral strategic authority. So again, with those familiar with how it works in London, there is a call-in process where the mayor in London can call in a strategic application and make the decision himself. In the future, that will be the same with mayoral strategic authorities. So in Surrey, the mayoral strategic authority will be able to deal with major applications itself and effectively take responsibility away from the local planning authority. But there will also be a number of other tools at development corporations, mayoral development corporations, strategic infrastructure tariff, so similar to community infrastructure tariff, but on a bigger scale. So if you've got a large bit of infrastructure that needs to be provided, then the new strategic authority will be able to raise that extra tariff to pay for that. That's only been used once so far, and that was in a London context in terms of Crossrail 1, where the mayoral tariff paid for a big chunk of that through the development that opened up, the opportunities that opened up. Planning and Infrastructure Bill is the main legislative tool, mechanism that we're going to see. It has already been laid before Parliament. We have had its first reading yesterday. It is being, I think, fast-tracked through the system. The hope is that we will have an act by the autumn, at the earliest, probably by the end of the year at the latest. That sets out the governance structure. It sets out the different very high-level legislative requirements. There'll be a lot of secondary legislation needed around that, so statutory instruments to actually take some of this forward. But that is going to be the one that allows the County Council to become that strategic planning authority. Work, however, I think in all of these is going to have to start now. So gathering the evidence base. Surrey's in a really strong position because it has got all that work already on its local nature recovery strategy. It's already looking at what a local environment improvement plan is, and it has also done the place ambition. So there's a huge amount of evidence and work that's already there that could be used to actually inform the Surrey Spatial Development Strategy as it's taken forward. But it won't be able to make the County Council won't be able to make any decisions on that until the legislation comes into effect, probably by the end of the year. So lots of work to be done. There will be also sitting alongside that national development management policies, which some of you will have heard of. That is where the development management policies that currently sit both within local plans but also the national planning policy framework will be taken out and will be set separately. So local plans in future will be much more focused on site allocations and the more detailed aspects around place shaping. And they won't have many development management policies, certainly won't have the ones that they've got at the moment. So things like managing an application in the Green Belt the policies that apply to that will be the national policies and not the local plan policies. That's just to give you one example, but there will be lots more. We're expecting a consultation on that by the end of May. There will also be a consultation in May around some of the sort of policy aspects of the new spatial development strategy. We've already had some announcements around what the new local plan system looks like as well. So again, for those familiar, we had the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which introduced a very different approach to local plans. And the current government has now signalled what areas that it is actually going to take forward. And most of that is intact. So a lot of that is around checks and balances throughout the local plan process, so that when a local plan is actually submitted, it is sound. We've had too many examples where local plans have been submitted where they're not ready to be submitted, or frankly, where the local planning authority doesn't want to make some difficult decisions and thinks that that should be dealt with through the examination, and we've ended up with very long protracted examination processes, which is not where we're supposed to be. When a plan is submitted, it's supposed to be the plan that the council wants to come out the other end, and it is supposed to be, in their view, a sound, technically sound and legally compliant plan. So lots of checks and balances being introduced. But I think for both the SDS, the Spatial Development Strategy, and the local plan, the thing that I think is going to be so much more exciting is that these are going to be vision-led, outcome-focused. And that is not something we've had for a very long time. That, as a spatial planner, is the bit that's exciting to me. It gives us much more scope to actually plan properly. And it also means that the community engagement process happens much more upstream as the local plan is prepared and as the spatial development strategy is prepared, and reduce the burden on the development management, the decision making at the other end. And again, there's been a lot of criticism with the government's proposals around modernising planning committees, taking perhaps some of the decision making out of the politics. But the idea is that if you get a local plan-led system or a plan-led system working effectively, then all that engagement happens much earlier in the process, and therefore local communities get to inform, and all the other stakeholder groups get to inform the local plan much earlier in the process. So there's less need to get involved at that development management level. If you've got an up-to-date plan, then your application, if it's compliant with the local plan, then there should be less scope to refuse that application. Just to mention some work that's going on now in terms of what that spatial development strategy will look like. The government has set out the process, the governance, but there's an awful lot that still needs to be thought about around what the scope and content is, how it will be tested, and that very important stakeholder and community engagement process. So there is a national strategic planning group that's been looking at this and working with government officials, with the planning inspector, National Infrastructure Commission, the New Towns Task Force, all the various groups. We've been looking at how we make sure that this system is integrated from the national level all the way down. So making sure that national infrastructure, anything that comes out of the New Towns Task Force, is actually fully, works right across the whole plan system. Local plans, strategic plans all work together with any national priorities. So that's been quite an exciting process to be involved in. That report will be published in May, and that will hopefully provide an awful lot more of the context for the government in terms of taking forward how this new system is going to work. It also looks at things like delivery plan, which sounds really, really dry, but actually that's the most important bit of this. There's no point in us preparing spatial development strategies if they're just going to sit on a shelf. They have to actually be capable of being delivered, and because these are long-term plans and strategies, it's much more difficult to actually set down a 30-year delivery programme, so these will be done on a 10-year rolling basis. And local plans will be absolutely essential in that delivery framework, because at the end of the day, that the site allocations will sit within the local plan system. And this is sort of where we've got to in terms of what these new strategies will look like. This is the place ambition map. The idea is that most of the work within a spatial development strategy will sit within the actual key diagram. That will set out where the housing numbers will go, where any growth locations are going to go, where any major infrastructure is going to go. As I said earlier, it won't be on an ordnance survey map, but with the role of digital technology and data, will be absolutely clear where any urban extension, for example, is going to go, because you'll be able to zoom in on the map, and we'll have a much more flexible approach to how this works and how this operates. We're not looking at big tomes, we're looking at a strategy that is probably maybe 10 pages long. It will do what it has to do. I think the digital technology is going to be the exciting bit, because that's actually going to help us be able to think of different spatial strategies across Surrey. You know, do you align your development to where the infrastructure is, existing and proposed? Do you align it with where the jobs are? Do you align it with proximity to places like Heathrow, Gatwick, London? Do you just carry on and focus as much as possible on the existing urban areas, or do you look at new growth opportunities? So this could end up with quite a different Surrey in future, and there's no, you know, you can't escape that. Again, the housing numbers, if they remain the same, are huge. So we have to think differently, but also it gives us the opportunity to really embed the environment from the start, and embed things like nature recovery right from the start. And again, that's something that we need to make sure that whoever's doing this within the County Council actually understands that. This has to be an integrated framework. It has to look at all these different things and not just the housing numbers for this to work properly. And that is a very quick canter through the new world of spatial planning. And I suspect there are some questions and comments there. I have tried not to be too provocative, but I know it's there are going to be some things in there that are not particularly palatable. I'm going to leave it on that diagram because I think it's quite useful.
Thank you very much, Catriona, and thank you very much for the resource as well. The slides, I think, will be extremely useful for people to follow up with afterwards. The floor is open for questions. We've got about 10 minutes, and so please, if you'd like to ask a question, put your hand up clearly, and we can begin. I had a... They're stunned.
Bored everyone?
No, I don't think so. I think they're digesting. I've got a question, actually. How does local... I mean, obviously, this is the Surrey Nature Partnership, so we're very interested in how local biodiversity interests get sort of embedded into this, dare I say it, much grander system or much sort of strategic system?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the particular challenges I think we've got under the system is that local nature recovery strategies are being prepared at that strategic scale. Biodiversity net gain has been managed at the very local level, and the feedback that I've seen right across the country has been, it's been very difficult to manage it with the two different geographies. Local nature recovery strategy in future will be managed at the same scale as the spatial plan, so there will be much more opportunity to embed it from the start into the sort of plan system. So I think it will improve that real integration between things like that, and also down to the local level as well.
Okay, thank you.
You mentioned that with the spatial development strategy that the involvement of the public is early on. The idea is that the involvement is early on, whereas with the current planning system, we get an application and then people can respond. Now, I'm not sure, I'm not convinced that, you know, because I've had consultations coming through and things like that. I'm not convinced that you really get people to respond. You know, a lot of people probably won't respond to consultations because it's you know, it's airy-fairy. And so my concern is that, you know, people won't really get their say like they would with the current system. So have you got anything to alleviate my concerns?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. There's actually a separate work stream looking down specifically at engagement, not consultation, because there will only be one consultation, formal consultation stage within that sort of 2-year programme. But the idea is that there will be a lot more engagement all the way through the process. And you're right. I mean, I was responsible for the Surrey Structure Plan. I was the director for the South East Plan. Engaging people in high-level frameworks is really challenging. But these will operate at 2 different levels. So you'll have the Surrey-wide policies and strategies, policies that fit into that. But then, as I said, these plans will also have to identify urban extensions, new growth areas, so there will be more targeted engagement in the areas most affected. So it will have to operate at 2 scales. But I think one of the challenges is that none of this is starting with a blank sheet of paper. One of the real roles of a spatial development strategy is to implement national policy and priorities. So you are doing a different job than from a bottom-up local plan. But in local plans in future will still have that critical role as well as implementing the spatial development strategy. So getting that balance right between, and managing expectations of local communities when you start that engagement process, saying, look, we've got to do certain things here. There is certain things you will be able to influence directly, and there is a lot of this that you won't be able to influence. So having an honest conversation is going to be important. But the experience we've had in Liverpool, which is currently preparing a local spatial development strategy, is that they used digital technology, social media really effectively. They targeted hard-to-reach groups. A lot of the information they got back was around health inequalities and climate. So they worked really hard to get to communities that don't necessarily have a voice in planning. And I think the role of digital technology and social media is going to be really important going forward on this. And it will have to be on an ongoing basis. But the other thing I think that we're looking at in terms of how this is managed is things like citizens panels, that sort of model where the strategic authority can have a representative demographically and socioeconomically representative panel, a citizens panel, to help manage the plan as it's developed. So I think that's exciting. But then don't forget, you also have that vision-led upfront process at the local plan scale as well. So there's going to be different bites at the cherry for local communities to influence this, and for stakeholder groups as well.
Hi, Catriona. Andrew Benson, Reigate and Banstead Borough Council. Is Surrey the right size and geography for a strategic development strategy? I know the Planning and Infrastructure Bill laid the foundations for it being across strategic areas. I think one of your slides said that Surrey would be the authority or the geography for the SDS. Is that a known, or is there a possibility that it could cover a wider area such as Surrey and Sussex? Thanks.
It's pretty much a known. So the government's got a map that is probably about 95% sorted in terms of the strategic geography. There's a couple of areas outside Surrey that are slightly more challenging in terms of how they manage it. So in terms of spatial geography, as you'll know, Andrew, there is no perfect strategic planning geography. There will always be cross-boundary issues to manage. Surrey has its devolution deal going forward, and the government's quite clear that the devolution geography should map the spatial planning geography, and that is also to make sure that if there are the extra delivery tools, spatial infrastructure tariff and things like that, that it's the same geography, it's been managed on the same geography. But there are always going to be cross-boundary issues, as you say. You've got Gatwick, you've got Heathrow, you've got Blackwater Valley, you've got London. We had common policies in previous days in the structure plans where West Sussex, Hampshire, etc., we worked together to create a common policy area. The same applied in the regional strategies. For those familiar, we had Milton Keynes, South Midlands, where 3 different regional strategies had the same policy framework for an area that overlapped. So there's different ways to manage the geography. There are also different spatial geographies. We have river catchment areas that run through different areas. We have national parks that run through different spatial geographies. Minerals and waste is a totally different spatial geography as well, housing market areas, whatever. So what the government is trying to do is make sure that the sum of the parts add up. So every area is covered by a spatial development strategy. but that the overlaps are managed. One of the models potentially that we're looking at is we have what we call regional aggregates working parties, where there's a bigger geography where the different minerals planning authorities work together to make sure that any overlaps are managed across a larger geography. So there's going to be different tools to help that. The fact that we've got a bigger geography doesn't mean the overlaps disappear. One of the biggest challenges, I think, for Surrey is the relationship with London. The Mayor is progressing the London Plan Review very quickly, and its allocation is 88,000 houses a year, which, frankly, London has never met, and it's never consumed its own smoke. So there's some big issues that Surrey's going to have to face in terms of that relationship. But yeah, there is no perfect geography, but I would say that the government's fairly certain that Surrey will be the spatial planning geography. I've not heard any arguments from anywhere around that. You've also got, so you've got the Sussex, to Sussex, Brighton, Hove, that will be one geography. You've got the Hampshire, Isle Portsmouth, and that will be the other geography. One of the geographies that's up for question is what you do with the Thames Valley. So at the moment, it's looking at either a Berkshire and Oxfordshire spatial development strategy, or a Berkshire, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire spatial geography. So you'll have sort of probably three spatial development strategies around you, plus the London plan. But yeah, there is no perfect geography, absolutely not.
Hi, Louise from SWT Ecology Services, and Principal Ecologist there. You mentioned the local nature recovery strategy at the moment is not authority specific. It's not being developed at the same level as the local planning authority with the BNG. So does that mean, so for example, Surrey, where there's biodiversity opportunity areas, any emerging local nature recovery strategy to inform ecologists how to assign strategic significance in biodiversity net gain is not taking into account that specific BOA if, for example, the site falls within a biodiversity opportunity area? Because at the moment, in the absence of the local nature recovery strategy, if the site fell within a BOA, we'd give the habitats a high strategic significance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm assuming that will get taken into account in the emerging local nature recovery strategy, and then the local nature recovery strategy will directly influence what comes in through the spatial development strategy. There will always be choices to be made, and whatever's in the LNRS won't necessarily translate 100% into spatial development strategy, and I think that's important. But yeah, the fact that you are advanced in the work on the LNRS, and Surrey had already, as you say, done a huge amount of work through the Local Nature Partnership on this sort of thing, then I think you're in a good position for that directly to inform the spatial development strategy.
And I think we had one more here, and we'll make that our last question before we go to the panel.
Thanks. Hi, Glenn Westmore, Surrey County Council. I'm just wondering how we keep the focus on capacity and delivery through the planning and consultee resources that we have, what with devolution, LGR. There's going to be a lot going on. How do we keep the focus on delivering the SDS and the associated new local plans?
Yeah, I'd say that's the biggest challenge, especially, I mean, not all of England is impacted by devolution and local government restructuring, but a lot of places are impacted by both, as you say, Surrey being one of them. And the fact that Surrey's being fast-tracked with the LGR probably helps, because it means you're probably going to get to the position you need to be in quicker than other areas. So I have my own personal view on local government restructuring, in that I think as soon as the geography is known, shadow teams should be set up in planning resource as soon as possible. Local plans should start being prepared on that basis as soon as possible. In terms of the devolution and the role that the spatial development strategy should play, I think establishing a team again at Surrey as soon as possible and protecting that resource to get on and do the job as quick as possible, I think is going to be important. So I think there's practical ways that can be managed. The government's main concern, I think, is that local plan preparation will stop because of local government restructuring, and that is absolutely a likely scenario in many places. So they've got to think about how they support local authorities, and there's been a lot of funding, for example, given out recently for the Reg 18, plans at Reg 18 stage to do greenbelt reviews, etc. So they're trying to throw as much support to local planning authorities as possible to keep the sort of the wheels on the track. But I do think there needs to be a point in places like Surrey where the new geography, and we should know that by the end of the year, should then start informing how we plan, and we should start thinking about setting up shadow teams. I also think that's the fairest way for the staff resource. You know, you're going to lose planners, and we can't lose planners. We've got few enough of them as it is. So I think some certainty around that should help.
Thank you. Catriona, thank you very much for that really full presentation and the Q&A. So if we could show our appreciation again.